Somewhere in the region of 200,000 people have been killed in a land war going on right now in Europe, the war in Ukraine. It's been going on in its full-scale version for the last 2 years and really dates back at least a decade. We're living in historic times with that kind of conflict going on, and it's easy to overlook it because for us, it's everyday life. Your world is changing in important ways. And today I wanted to step back and look at that in more detail. And one of the biggest, most important ways that this war in Ukraine is changing your world is the way that it is changing Europe. Europe is going through a historic shift. And this shift has happened small step by small step. But over the course of 2 years already, we have seen revolutionary changes. And we'll present to you 10 ways that Europe has been changed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We'll take it in turns to present a different change. We'll have some time to discuss it and then look at the next way. And I think just like we were, you'll be quite impressed at how much Europe is changing already based on this conflict. Did you want to kick things off then with your first point, the first way we've seen Europe change in response to this?
Yes, that's right. And that's the massive increase in funding for Germany's military. And that's one of those points where people look back on it and they try to marginalize it. But at the moment, it was absolutely massive. And Germany is one of the largest economies in the world and has access to the best military industry in the world, both of the United States and in Europe itself. So they said we will have a special fund in addition to our defense fund of 100 billion to increase our military stockpile.
And I think another country that we can kind of put it in context with is Russia itself. And you go back before the Ukraine invasion, because Russia defense spending has really catapulted over the last year or two. You go back before then, 2021, Russia was spending about 65 billion on its military. Germany was spending about 55 billion. So you add in the 100 billion special fund and you add in all this extra that Germany is spending and suddenly Germany is become a bigger military spender than Russia used to be. Historically, you've kind of had this thing where Germany is the economic power in Europe. They have the money, but France has the military. And France of the two is the bigger military spender. France has the kind of the legacy of empire that's still intact and they've got all the military bases across North Africa. And that, I think, is something that has shifted since the Ukrainian invasion, where Germany's taking on more of the military leadership of Europe. Massive increase in German military spending, massive increase in all of Europe's military spending. But moving on to point number 2, one of the other big things there's been a lot of discussion about with this invasion is nuclear war. For a conflict between two neighbors, one of which isn't nuclear, it is very interesting how important nuclear discussions have been to this Ukrainian conflict, and it's raised fears of nuclear war and then discussions of other countries getting nuclear weapons and some quite remarkable developments in moving towards nuclear weapons all across Europe. So there's always been this discussion of if things go really bad, is Russia going to resort to nuclear weapons? And I think some of those discussions are still ongoing. That's still a possibility as you see Ukraine invading Russia's own territory. Could you see something like that? But then also Russia has been using, I think it's the Iskander missiles, Kyber, hypersonic. I'll put that in scare quotes. I'm not sure I believe Russia that they're actually hypersonic at this point. There's some evidence they're not quite as good as Russia claims they are. But they've been using missiles that are capable of carrying nuclear weapons against Ukraine, just not been equipping them with nuclear weapons, which has blurred the line between short-range ballistic missiles. Are they nuclear? Are they not? That's something that makes people very worried, this increasing use of short-range missiles, because they can carry nuclear weapons, and then they, an intercontinental ballistic missile goes all the way into space and back down again. It gives you more time to respond. Short and medium-range missiles have a very different flight path, and so you have dramatically less time to decide, is this a nuclear attack? Is it something else? So you've had a lot of discussion on nuclear weapons, I think most noticeably between France, Germany, and then maybe Poland. But of course, it's not just nuclear weapons. Conventional weapons have had a major uptick over the last couple of years. And I believe that's the subject of your third point.
Yes, so Germany has been buying weapon systems from America, but at the same time, there's a strong push to invest at home too. So there's a stronger focus on the German or the European arms industry. Even with the F-35, Rheinmetall said, well, we can't just buy the F-35 from America. We actually have to cooperate with them to produce part of it in Germany. So it's a major cooperation that just resulted from that Ukraine war, from that increased focus on the arms industry. And again, Rheinmetall said, we can deliver you very soon 47 billion worth of equipment, ammunition, helicopters, armed vehicles. And Rheinmetall is the biggest arms manufacturer. Now Airbus is a European one, and they are more in the aerial military sector, but also in the civilian one. But the purely German one is Rheinmetall. They also had Tyson Group Marine System that said we can update your fleet, and they had Hensoldt. They said we can update your radar system. So you have a lot of arms manufacturers who suddenly came forward. We can suddenly exponentially increase our arms manufacturing to arm those troops. And they were actually disappointed to not get as many orders from that 100 billion as they would have liked to. But that's another big story where they said we can deliver so much, we can shift our production from producing part of the day to production night and day to arm you. We are ready to go.
The turnaround for European arms companies has been really, really remarkable. Our fourth point relates to some of these lessons from the Ukraine war, and that is we're seeing Germany reorganize its military. So this got started pretty quickly. June 2022, within the first year of the war, the then German defense minister, Christina Lambrecht, she announced a new military command center to unite different command structures. There was a big focus around 2023 on streamlining the bureaucracy. Like Ukraine really drove home to people the need for military to be able to move quickly. You know, you don't want all of these paperwork and getting things signed in triplicate, gumming things up. And then in April this year, you had a pretty radical revamp of the country's military to prepare it for war. So the defense minister, Boris Pistorius, came out and talked about how they wanted to make Germany more war capable. And I think to me, it's a fascinating takeaway from this Ukraine war, where they said, okay, we want to create a cyber command as a fourth branch of military. You know, we've got the army, we've got the navy, we've got the air force, we've got the cyber command. That's a pretty heavy emphasis on cyber command, and no one really has that. I mean, that European dimension, I think that brings us to the fifth point. And this, I think this in some ways is the big underreported story of the decade. This fifth point, but this is also something that has kicked into higher gear just in the last couple of years.
Yeah, military cooperation with other European countries. Germany again is at the center of it, so they can cooperate with the countries around them. One big story that we have been highlighting on just last year, the last Dutch combat brigade joined a German division. So basically, if they go to war, that Dutch combat brigade will go to war under German leadership.
Yeah, like Germany has swallowed the entire Dutch army.
Basically, like the combat brigade, is that what would defend the country in the end. And they said, well, Germany invaded us before, they are our biggest threat. So why don't we just cooperate with them so we eliminate a threat? So they just voluntarily submit. In World War II, they just basically let the German troops go through, and there was a lot of cooperation like that before then. But this is major.
I've done what I was afraid I would do, where I've completely stolen, I think, this entire point by jumping in on this point too early, and that is Germany moving east. So just like we talked about, Germany, they announced back in December, or they signed the deal that they'd be permanently stationing 5,000 troops in Lithuania. I mean, that breaks this major taboo for the German military. It's just about the last major taboo. I thought it was also just really interesting. You look at right around the same time, Germany kind of worked with Ukraine to upset the Polish elections. You look, it looks like they backed Ukraine in this dispute with Polish farmers over grain prices. It ended up undermining support for the main Polish political party that was pretty anti-German. They wanted to build up the Polish military. They didn't really like the leadership role that Germany was having in Europe. It was right after that election that the Lithuanian deal was signed, because who's between Germany and Lithuania? It's Poland. You need Poland on board, I think, for that kind of the logistical chain for that German base in Lithuania to really be viable. But I think we did leave a little bit more for you to talk about on this seventh point than I left myself on point 6.
It is one of maybe the most controversial points I want to bring up, but I feel quite strongly about it, and it's Germany testing weapons in Ukraine. Now, if you understand some of the back history, between World War I and World War II, Germany was not allowed to test weapons, to manufacture weapons, so they did some of that in Russia with building testing facilities there and sending weapons to be tested there. And before 2014, Rheinmetall was working on a large-scale testing facilities. It's like the largest in the world. This is now built in Russia, where Russia is testing its weapon system and strategies. But Germany has also been sending weapons directly to Ukraine, and now the question is, why is that? For example, Rheinmetall has built a factory there to be able to repair damaged vehicles, damaged tanks that Ukraine is using, like the Leopard tank they are using. Now, every time a tank gets damaged, you learn from it. Where did it get damaged? What's its most vulnerable point? How can we strengthen that point, that things like that don't happen again? How can we protect it from drone warfare? So tanks are a big thing, drone warfare is a big thing, but I really want to focus today mainly, and it's a little bit of a niche again, but it's AI. Artificial intelligence. So the Times wrote an article, for example, in February, that the Ukraine has become an AI war lab. Now that's the most traumatic situation, I think, in Ukraine right now, as far as what kind of military ramification it has for larger scale wars. What's tested in Ukraine will be the tools that will be used on a larger scale around the world in the future wars, because that's the opportunity people see now. How is AI transforming the military battlefield?
I think a lot of countries around the world are starting to wake up and say, okay, the wars that we're fighting, they're not going to be a repeat of, say, America's invasion of Iraq, that some things have fundamentally shifted. And so it's very revealing to see Germany working hard to be on the cutting edge of that technology change and trying to learn everything that they can about how to deal with this new battle space and these new technologies.
Yeah, and drones, swarms of drones are said to be more dangerous than nuclear weapons in a way, because if you can produce tiny drones and you can produce millions of them at a small cost, and if you send all of them like a swarm on an aircraft carrier, that aircraft carrier that costs billions of dollars, it will have a hard time defending itself. How can it shoot down so many drones? If you then send a missile after the drone swarm, what's going to happen to that aircraft carrier?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point, I think, that raises the stature of artificial intelligence. I mean, as we get into some of our last few points, these are changes, I think, that are in process, but maybe a bit more future looking. And so my 8th point is that the Ukraine war has exposed Europe's leadership void. You can make all of these military changes, but really you need a strong leader behind them. And I think you see that in Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine. I'm not holding up either of these people really as great men, certainly not on the same level as someone like Winston Churchill, but just in the fact that they are, say, strong personalities and visible personalities. I think we could accurately characterize both of them as that way. Like, that's what it takes to wage a war. And sure, it's not going, Putin, there's a lot of people saying, well, Putin made a mistake in even starting this in the first place. Maybe he did, but you're seeing a personality dominate world events. And Europe doesn't really have that. And you really felt that appetite for bold leadership and how much people got a taste of that and they loved it. And then it never really came back from Olaf Scholz. So we're seeing that vacuum. And I think this is a way where all of these different things are dramatic ways that prophecy has been fulfilled already in this crisis. And this is where we're seeing prophecy still to be fulfilled. And that brings us to our ninth point that I think you were going to introduce about the way that Germany views its military is changing.
Yes, one of the biggest points that is very underreported is how Germany sees its military and the change in overall view on the military. We already talked about the view on the military leadership, but another big point is how Germany sees its arms industry. That's the industry that got Germany into World War I. It got Germany into World War II. That was the industry that actually financed the rise of Adolf Hitler. That same industry, the same company, somehow didn't even bother to change their name, like Rheinmetall, to call them out. They didn't even change the way they called their tanks. Still, names according to Leopard, which is like an vicious animal, they called their tanks in World War II the same. The same military tradition continues, so it was a bit of a shame to work for some of those companies. But the way it is right now is, well, that's the industry that's going to protect us in the end. So the Germans are seeing that industry not as the one that got all that cruelty on them, but now it's more seen as a savior when times get tough.
That's a really interesting example of just a complete change in all of society, really. And I think you see some of this happening at the political level. Again, it's not a coincidence that this is happening since the Ukraine invasion. So April 25th, the Bundeswehr voted to establish an annual Veterans Day that will be held every year on June 15th. There's never been that before. Because who are the veterans within Germany historically? Well, it's been, at least for the last few decades, it's been the soldiers that fought for the Nazis. So they've not had a Veterans Day. Now, though, with what's going on in Ukraine, there's this changing view. Again, the soldiers, the military, there's the ones that keep us safe. And our final point relates to a whole bunch of European countries preparing to be ready for warfare. And that is this reintroduction of conscription. I think this is something that is very tangible and measurable, where a whole host of countries, they ended conscription after the Cold War, and now they're bringing it back. I think Lithuania was one of the first. Back in 2015, they brought back mandatory military service due to the, quote, changing geopolitical situation. So they've moved already. Sweden, they drafted 7,000 people in 2024. They're going to draft 8,000 next year. Latvia abolished compulsory military service in 2006. They brought it back, I think it was this January. Norway is doubling its defense budget. They're adding 20,000 conscripts. And then Europe, or Germany itself, is talking more and more about conscription. They ended their conscription in I think it was about 2010, 2011, sometime around there. And their first major tentative step, I think, comes in, it was announced June 12th, where Boris Pistorius said, well, they're going to send out a questionnaire to all young men. They'll have to answer this questionnaire. I think women can if they want. And it's going to ask about their interest and ability to serve in the military, basically. And then the military will use this questionnaire to select recruits for 6 months of service, with then the option to voluntarily extend their service to 2 years. But more and more European countries are saying we need more people in our armed forces. So that is our top 10 list of how Europe has been transformed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think the big thing to emphasize there is just, you take a step back, it really is impressive how much it has changed. And like we set up at the start, those changes were forecast specifically. Herbert W. Armstrong and now Sir Gerald Flurry, they both said, watch for Europe to change in these very specific ways due to Russian aggression. And we have seen this exactly. It has already played out. Yes, there's more to happen, but so much has already played out.